Hi, guys. Welcome to a journey into the darkest corridors of American history. Places where standard textbooks are simply too afraid to go. Today, we aren't just telling stories, we are plunging into a century of unsolved mysteries, bone chilling disasters, and government conspiracies that will make you question everything you thought you knew. In this massive 3 hour chronicle, we're uncovering files that have gathered dust for decades, from the bizarre era of mailing live babies through the post office to the extraterrestrial secrets of Area 51. We are covering it all, so grab your headphones, dim the lights, and settle in. But before we dive into the shadows, if you live for a good mystery, hit that like button right now. And if you want to join our community of truth seekers, make
The history of the United States is often presented as a dry sequence of dates and political treaties, but beneath the surface of the textbook narrative lies a reality that is far more surreal, chaotic, and downright bizarre than most people realize. To understand the American psyche, one must look at the early 20th century, a time when the infrastructure of the country was expanding faster than the laws could keep up with. One of the most mind-bending chapters in this era involves the United States Post Office. In 1913, the introduction of parcel post was intended to help farmers send crops and goods across the vast distances of the American heartland, but the lack of specific regulations led to a phenomenon that sounds like a dark comedy today: mailing children. It began in rural Ohio when Jesse and Matilda Beagle realized it was cheaper to pay 15 cents in postage stamps than to buy a train ticket for their infant son, James. They handed the baby to a trusted mail courier who safely delivered him to his grandmother's house just a few miles away. This wasn't an isolated incident. It became a bizarre trend where parents would literally stamp their children and hand them over to postal workers. One of the most famous cases involved 5-year-old May Pistoff, who was mailed 73 miles across Idaho to visit her grandparents. The postal workers of that era were often pillars of the community, so parents trusted them more than the burgeoning railway corporations. The Postmaster General eventually had to step in and issue a formal decree in 1915 stating that humans were no longer mailable material, ending a brief but terrifyingly literal era of special delivery. While the post office was figuring out that babies aren't packages, the very face of America was undergoing a chemical transformation. The Statue of Liberty, an icon of freedom gifted by France in 1886, was never meant to be the mint green landmark we see today. When it first arrived in New York Harbor, it was a shimmering metallic brown, constructed from over 60,000 pounds of raw copper. For the first 2 decades of its life, it looked like a giant new penny standing against the skyline. However, the salt air and acidic rain of the Atlantic triggered a process called patination. This chemical reaction created a thin layer of copper carbonate, which gradually turned the brown skin into the distinct seafoam green we recognize now. By 1906, the American government was so concerned by this rusting that they allocated $60,000 to paint the statue. The public, however, revolted, having grown to love the green hue as a symbol of endurance. The painting was cancelled, and the green remained. This theme of accidental identity continues in the naming of major cities, specifically Portland, Oregon. In 1845, two land claims owners, Francis Pettygrove and A.S.A. Lovejoy, couldn't decide what to call their new settlement. Pettygrove wanted Portland after his home in Maine, while Lovejoy wanted Boston after his home in Massachusetts. Instead of a political compromise or a battle of wills, they settled the future of the Pacific Northwest with a copper penny. They held a best-of-3 coin toss. Pettygrove won 2 out of 3, and Portland it was. Had the coin landed differently, the entire cultural map of the West Coast would be different today. These stories of babies in mailbags, copper, statues changing colors, and cities founded on a coin flip reveal an America that was built on a mixture of wild improvisation and accidental genius. As we move deeper into this 3-hour journey, we will see that this trend of the weird and the bold is not a glitch in American history, but its primary feature. We are just scratching the surface of a nation built on myths, mistakes, and the most unexpected human behaviors imaginable.
To understand the sheer scale of the terror that gripped Salem, Massachusetts, In 1692, one must first visualize a society living on the edge of a vast, unexplored wilderness, fueled by extreme religious fervor and the constant threat of smallpox and frontier warfare. The tragedy began not with a cult or a real coven of witches, but in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, where his 9-year-old daughter Betty and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams started exhibiting behaviors that defied medical explanation. They would scream in agony, crawl under furniture, and contort their limbs into positions that seemed physically impossible. Under the intense pressure of a Puritan society that saw the devil in every shadow, the girls were pushed to name the people pinching and choking them in the spiritual realm. The first to be accused were the marginalized, the ones who couldn't fight back. Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Paris household, became the primary target, and under the threat of death, she confessed to seeing the devil in the form of a black dog and a red cat, claiming there was a book signed by many in the village. This confession acted as a catalyst, turning a local medical anomaly into a full-blown judicial nightmare. The Court of Oria and Termina was established, and it allowed the use of spectral evidence, a legal absurdity where the accuser could claim they were being attacked by the spectre or ghost of a person, even if the person's physical body was miles away. This meant there was no defense. To deny the accusation was seen as the devil's work, and to confess was the only way to save one's neck. The hysteria spiraled out of control as neighbors realized they could use the trials to settle decades-old grudges over land boundaries and inheritance. If you wanted your neighbor's farm, you simply accused them of witchcraft. The most harrowing moment of this era was the execution of Giles Corey, an 80-year-old farmer who refused to stand trial because he knew the court would seize his property and leave his sons with nothing. To force a plea, the authorities subjected him to peine forte et dure, or pressing. They laid him on the ground and piled massive stone slabs on his chest. For 2 days, Corey suffered in silence, and every time the sheriff asked for a plea, Corey simply responded, "More weight." He was eventually crushed to death, but because he never pleaded, his land remained in his family. By the time the madness ended in May 1693, 20 people had been executed, including a former minister and several elderly women, while dozens more died in the freezing, filth-ridden jails. This was a moment where the American legal system failed, so spectacularly that it eventually led to the fundamental right of being innocent until proven guilty. The Salem witch trials serve as a grim reminder that when fear is weaponized by the state, the first casualty is always the truth. The shadows of Salem still linger in the American consciousness, a warning of what happens when a community replaces logic with a hunt for monsters. The Phantom of the Sky, the Legend of D.B. Cooper. On the afternoon of November 24, 1971, a man calling himself Dan Cooper approached the Northwest Orient Airlines counter in Portland, Oregon, and used cash to purchase a one-way ticket for Flight 305 bound for Seattle. To the naked eye, he was the embodiment of a mid-century corporate drone dressed in a dark business suit, a crisp white shirt, a black clip-on tie, and carrying a nondescript black attach case. He boarded the Boeing 727, took seat 18C, and calmly ordered a bourbon and soda while the engines hummed to life. Shortly after takeoff, he handed a note to Florence Schaffner, a flight attendant who initially ignored it, thinking it was just a lonely traveler's phone number. Cooper leaned toward her and whispered with chilling composure, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The note demanded $200,000 in negotiable American currency, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle. To prove his threat, he opened his briefcase just enough to reveal a terrifying array of red cylinders, wires, and a large battery. As the plane circled Seattle for 2 hours to allow authorities to gather the ransom, Cooper remained remarkably calm, smoking cigarettes and chatting politely with the crew, showing an intimate knowledge of the local terrain and the technical specifications of the aircraft. Once the money and parachutes were delivered in Seattle, Cooper released all 36 passengers but kept the crew hostage, ordering the pilots to fly toward Mexico City at the lowest possible airspeed and an altitude of exactly 10,000 feet. He specifically demanded the landing gear remain down and the rear air stairs stay open. Somewhere over the rugged, pitch-black wilderness of southwest Washington, amid a brutal winter thunderstorm and freezing temperatures, Cooper did the unthinkable. He strapped the money to his body, donned 2 of the parachutes, and stepped out of the back of the plane into the howling wind and rain. By the time the aircraft landed in Reno, Nevada, the man known as Dearby, Cooper had vanished into the void. The FBI launched Operation Norjack, the most extensive and expensive manhunt in aviation history. Scouring the treacherous, heavily forested Cascades, they found nothing, no parachute, no body, and no trace of the $200,000. For 9 years, the case remained a total vacuum until 1980, when an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram, digging in the sand along the Columbia River at a spot called Tina Bar, discovered 3 rotting bundles of $20 bills, totaling $5,800. The serial numbers matched the ransom money, yet the rest of the fortune was missing. The discovery raised more questions than answers. Did Cooper die in the junk and his body wash away? Or did he survive and bury the money? Hundreds of suspects were investigated, ranging from Special Forces veterans to disgruntled airline employees. But none of the evidence was conclusive. The FBI officially closed the case in 2016, but the legend of Dearby Cooper lives on as the only unsolved skyjacking in commercial aviation history. He remains a folk hero to some and a ghost to others, representing the ultimate escape from the system. A man who walked into the clouds and became a permanent mystery. At the height of the Cold War, the United States government became consumed by a paranoid obsession that the Soviet Union and China had developed advanced brainwashing techniques to turn American prisoners of war into sleeper agents. In response, the CIA launched a top-secret program in 1953, known as Project McUltra, headed by the chemist Sidney Gottlieb. This was not a small-scale experiment. It was a sprawling, multi-decade operation that involved over 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, and prisons, many of which didn't even know they were part of a CIA project. The goal was as ambitious as it was terrifying: to discover a way to manipulate human mental states, erase memories, and create Manchurian candidates who could be programmed to carry out assassinations or withhold information under interrogation. To achieve this, the CIA turned to a cocktail of psychological torture and chemical warfare. Thousands of unsuspecting civilians were administered high doses of LSD, often without their knowledge or consent. In one of the most notorious sub-projects, Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York, hiring sex workers to lure men to these apartments so that agents could watch through one-way mirrors as the men were secretly drugged. The experiments didn't stop at hallucinogens. They escalated into the use of electroconvulsive therapy at levels far beyond medical standards, sensory deprivation, isolation, and verbal abuse. One of the most tragic victims was Frank Olson, a government scientist who was covertly drugged with LSD at a retreat and subsequently fell to his death from a hotel window in New York. While the government ruled it as suicide, his family has fought for decades to prove he was murdered to keep the project's secrets. The horror extended to Canada, where the CIA funded Dr. Ewan Cameron at McGill University. Cameron's depatterning experiments involved putting patients into drug-induced comas for weeks and playing recorded messages on loop to rebuild their personalities. The project only came to light in 1975 when the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission investigated illegal CIA activities within the United States. However, much of the truth was lost forever because Sidney Gottlieb had ordered all McUltra records destroyed in 1973. Fearing the legal repercussions. What remains of the files reveals a chilling disregard for human rights and the terrifying reality that, for 20 years, the American government conducted a war on the minds of its own people. This era proved that the most dangerous secrets aren't always held by foreign enemies, but can be hidden in the very institutions sworn to protect the public. The Donner Party, the descent into the white healthy mid-19th century in America, was defined by the Manifest Destiny, a feverish belief that pioneers were destined to expand across the continent to the Pacific. But in 1846, this dream turned into a visceral nightmare for a group of nearly 90 migrants known as the Donner Party. Led by George and Jacob Donner and James Reed, the group left Springfield, Illinois, with dreams of the fertile lands of California. Their fatal mistake began with a reliance on a guidebook by Lansford Hastings, who promoted a shortcut known as the Hastings Cutoff. Hastings had never actually traveled the full route himself, and the shortcut turned out to be a grueling trek through the rugged Wasatch Mountains and the soul-crushing Great Salt Lake Desert. Instead of saving time, the party lost weeks, arriving at the base of the Sierra Nevada mountains just as a freakishly early and massive winter storm system began to move in. By the time they reached what is now Truckee Lake, the mountain passes were choked with 5 feet of snow, trapping their wagons and killing their livestock. As the temperatures plummeted and the food supplies vanished, the group split into 2 camps, huddled in makeshift cabins and tents made of frozen animal hides. They were forced to eat their dogs, then the hides of their cattle, and eventually boiled old rugs and bones to create a tasteless, nutrient-free glue. As the weeks turned into months, the human body began to fail. Desperation replaced morality. In mid-December, a small group known as the Forlorn Hope attempted to snowshoe out for help. Of the 15 who started, only 7 survived, and they were the first to admit to the unthinkable. They had consumed the flesh of those who died along the way to stay alive. Back at the camps, the situation was even more dire. Parents watched their children wither away, and soon the taboo of cannibalism became a grim necessity for survival. When rescue parties finally reached them in February 1847, they found a scene that looked like a circle of hell. Survivors were described as ghost-like, living in filth among the remains of their friends and family members. Out of the 87 people who entered the mountains, only 47 made it out alive. The tragedy of the Donner Party became a permanent scar on the American westward expansion, a story not just of poor planning, but of the absolute limits of human endurance and the terrifying lengths to place survival above civilization. It remains a haunting reminder that the wilderness of the American West was one not just with courage, but with unimaginable suffering and the total collapse of the human spirit. The Centralia mine fire, the town that is burning from within. The Donner Party was a tragedy of the cold. The story of Centralia, Pennsylvania, is a tragedy of eternal fire. Once a bustling coal mining town, Centralia is now a ghost town with a terrifying secret. It has been burning from the inside out for over 60 years. The disaster began in May 1962, when the town council decided to clean up the local landfill by setting it on fire. What they didn't realize was that the landfill was located directly over an old opening to a massive labyrinth of abandoned anthracite coal mines. The fire seeped through the cracks and ignited a coal seam so vast that it provided enough fuel to burn for centuries. For years, the residents tried to ignore the smell of sulfur and the wisps of smoke rising from the ground, but by the 1970s, the danger became impossible to hide. Carbon monoxide began leaking into basements, and the ground temperature in some backyards reached over 900 degrees Fahrenheit. The turning point came in 1981, when a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was playing in his yard, and a sinkhole suddenly opened beneath his feet. He was saved only by grabbing onto a tree root as he stared down into a pit of scorching hot steam and toxic gas. The federal government realized the town was no longer habitable and began a multi-million-dollar buyout program to relocate the residents. Today, Centralia is a desolate wasteland where Route 61 is buckled and cracked, covered in graffiti, and venting white smoke into the air. Most of the houses have been leveled, the zip code has been revoked, and only a handful of stubborn residents remain, living atop a ticking time bomb. It is estimated that there is enough coal beneath the surface to keep the fire burning for another 250 years. Centralia stands as a modern-day ruin, a literal hell on earth created by a simple human error, proving that some fires once started can never be put out. The Great Molasses flood the sticky death of Boston in the north end of Boston on an unusually warm day in January 1919. A massive, poorly constructed steel tank owned by the Purity Distilling Company stood 5 stories tall, filled to the brim with 2.3 million gallons of fermenting molasses. This wasn't just syrup for pancakes. It was a vital industrial ingredient used to create munitions and alcohol for the war effort. For days, the residents of the neighborhood had heard the tank groaning and grumbling, and brown syrup often leaked through the rivets so that local children would scrape the leaks off with sticks. But at approximately 12:40 p.m. on January 15th, the structural integrity of the tank finally failed. A massive explosion of rivets, resembling machine gun fire, preceded a tidal wave of molasses that stood 25 feet high and was 160 feet wide. This was not a slow-moving liquid. Because of the weight and pressure, the wave roared through the streets at 35 miles per hour. It was so powerful that it smashed the girders of the nearby elevated railway and crushed entire buildings as if they were made of cardboard. People and horses were caught in the viscous, suffocating flow. As the molasses cooled in the winter air, it thickened, acting like quicksand. Rescuers found it nearly impossible to move through the waist-deep sludge to reach victims. 21 people were killed, and over 150 were injured, many of them suffocating as the syrup hardened in their lungs. The cleanup took weeks, requiring hundreds of people to scrub the streets with salt water and sand, and it is said that for decades afterward, on hot summer days, the north end of Boston still smelled faintly of sweet, rotting molasses. This disaster led to some of the first major class action lawsuits in America and forced the government to implement stricter engineering and safety regulations for industrial construction. It remains a terrifying example of how corporate negligence can turn a common kitchen ingredient into a lethal weapon of mass destruction. Area 51, the desert of secrets and silent ski steep in the desolate Nevada desert, tucked away behind the Groom Lake salt flat and surrounded by keep out signs that authorize the use of deadly force, lies the most famous secret on Earth, Area 51. While the world's imagination is fueled by stories of crashed UFOs and alien autopsies, the declassified history of the base is perhaps even more fascinating. Established in 1955 by the CIA for Project Aquatone, the site was chosen because its remote location and flat lakebed were perfect for testing the U-2 spy plane, a top-secret aircraft designed to fly at altitudes of 70,000 feet far above the reach of Soviet radar. The UFO sightings that began in the late 1950s were often actually sightings of these secret planes. When the sun hit the titanium wings of a high-altitude jet, it reflected light in a way that made it look like a glowing, unidentifiable object to commercial pilots below. Throughout the Cold War, Area 51 was the birthplace of the most advanced black project technology in existence, including the Senior 71 Blackbird, which could fly at Mach 3, and the F-117 Nighthawk, the world's first stealth fighter. The secrecy was so intense that the base didn't even officially exist on government maps until the 2000s. The alien lore grew in the late 1980s when a man named Robert Lazar claimed he had worked on reverse engineering extraterrestrial craft at a nearby site called S4. While his claims have been widely debunked by experts, they cemented Area 51's place in pop culture. Whether it holds little green men or just the next generation of hypersonic weapons that can circle the globe in an hour, Area 51 remains the ultimate symbol of the American deep state, a place where the future is built in total darkness. Far away from the eyes of the public, it is meant to protect. The War of Currents, Edison, Tesla, and the battle for the soul of light late 1880s in America saw a technological civil war that would determine how the modern world was powered, a conflict known as the War of Currents. On one side was Thomas Alva Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park, who had invested his entire fortune and reputation into direct current DC. DC was safe but inefficient. It could only travel about a mile before the voltage dropped, meaning a power plant would be needed on every city block. On the other side stood his former employee, the Serbian-American genius Nikola Tesla, backed by the industrialist George Westinghouse. Tesla championed alternating current AC, which could be stepped up to high voltages and sent hundreds of miles over thin wires. Edison, realizing his financial empire was at risk, launched one of the most ruthless smear campaigns in history. He began proving that AC was deadly by publicly electrocuting stray dogs, cats, and even horses using Tesla's system. The propaganda reached a gruesome peak when Edison secretly helped design the first electric chair using AC power to ensure that the public would associate Tesla's invention with death and execution. The first execution of William Kemmler was a botched horror show that took 8 minutes of agonizing shocks, prompting Westinghouse to remark that they would have done better with an axe. However, the truth of physics couldn't be suppressed by propaganda. At the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, Tesla and Westinghouse underbid Edison and lit the entire White City with AC power, a spectacle so breathtaking it effectively ended the war. Shortly after, Tesla harnessed Niagara Falls to power Buffalo, New York, proving that AC was the future. While Edison died a wealthy man, Tesla died nearly penniless in a New York hotel, obsessed with feeding pigeons and dreaming of wireless energy. The world we live in today, with its sprawling power grids and instant electricity, is the direct result of Tesla's vision. Yet, the battle remains a dark reminder of how corporate greed can attempt to stifle human progress through fear and manipulation. The Manhattan Project, the city that didn't exist as the world plunged into the chaos of World War II. The United States launched the most expensive and secretive scientific endeavor in human history, the Manhattan Project. This wasn't just a laboratory experiment. It was a secret empire. From 1942 to 1946, the government built entire secret cities from scratch, such as Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Los Alamos, New Mexico, which housed over 130,000 workers but appeared as nothing more than empty space on official maps. Most employees, including the young women operating the complex machinery to enrich uranium, had no idea what they were actually making. They were told only to watch their dials and keep their mouths shut under the threat of treason. Security was so tight that even Vice President Harry Truman didn't know about the project until FDR died. Under the scientific leadership of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the world's most brilliant minds, many of them refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe, raced against time to split the atom before Hitler's scientists could. The moral weight of the project was crushing. Many scientists, including Oppenheimer himself, realized they were becoming death, the destroyer of worlds. The first successful test, code-named Trinity, turned the desert sand of New Mexico into green glass and signaled the dawn of the nuclear age. But the secrecy didn't end with the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For decades, the project's environmental and health impacts on downwinders, civilians exposed to radioactive fallout, were covered up by the government. The Manhattan Project changed the nature of war forever, creating a world where humanity finally possessed the power to erase itself from existence. It remains the ultimate example of what happens when the full industrial and scientific might of a nation is directed toward a single, terrifying goal in total darkness. Prohibition, the law that created the underworld in January 1920. The United States embarked on a radical social experiment known as Prohibition, enacted through the 18th Amendment. The goal was to purify the nation by banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. Instead of creating a moral utopia, it inadvertently engineered the most sophisticated criminal infrastructure in human history. Overnight, a massive multi-billion-dollar industry was handed over to the underworld. Ordinary citizens became criminals, as speakeasies, secret illegal bars popped up in every basement and back alley, often requiring a whispered password to enter. The demand for booze was so high that it birthed the rum runners and bootleggers, who modified their cars with high-performance engines to outrun the police, a practice that would eventually evolve into the multi-million-dollar sport of NASCAR. However, the most dangerous byproduct was the rise of organized crime figures like Al Capone in Chicago and Lucky Luciano in New York. These men weren't just street thugs. They were CEOs of crime, corrupting judges, police chiefs, and mayors with protection. Money. The violence became public and brutal, reaching a peak in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, where Capone's men, dressed as police officers, executed 7 rivals in cold blood. The government's response was equally desperate. In a horrifying and little-known twist, the US government actually ordered the poisoning of industrial alcohol to discourage people from drinking it, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 10,000 citizens. By 1933, the nation realized the noble experiment was a catastrophic failure. Prohibition had not stopped drinking. It had only funded the mafia, increased corruption, and turned the law into a joke. When it was finally repealed, it left behind a permanent legacy of organized crime that would haunt American law enforcement for the next century. The moon landing, one giant leap for propaganda. By the late 1960s, the Cold War was no longer just a struggle for terrestrial territory. It had become a race for the heavens. After the Soviet Union humiliated the United States by launching Sputnik and putting Yuri Gagarin into orbit, President John F. Kennedy made a desperate, high-stakes gamble. America would land a man on the moon before the decade was out. This was not just a scientific mission. It was the ultimate ideological battle. If America won, it proved that capitalism and democracy were superior to communism. The Apollo 11 mission on July 20, 1969, was the most watched event in human history. But the technical reality was terrifyingly fragile. The lunar module, the Eagle, had a computer with less processing power than a modern-day toaster, and during the final descent, it began flashing 1202 alarms, indicating a system overload. Neil Armstrong had to take manual control, flying the craft over a boulder-strewn crater with only 30 seconds of fuel remaining before the mission would have to be aborted. When he finally uttered the words, "The Eagle has landed," a global audience of 600 million people exhaled in unison. However, the mission's success also birthed one of the most persistent conspiracy theories in history, that the landing was faked on a soundstage by director Stanley Kubrick. While scientists have debunked these claims 1,000 times, pointing to the mirrors left on the moon that lasers still bounce off of today, the faked narrative persists because the moon landing was, in essence, the greatest piece of theater ever produced. It was a moment of genuine human achievement, but it was also a calculated move to secure American global dominance. The Apollo program was cancelled just 3 years later once the political goal was achieved, leaving the moon silent for decades, and proving that sometimes the drive to beat an enemy is more powerful than the drive for pure discovery.
The Unabomber, the scholar who became a monster for 17 years, the most brilliant and elusive terrorist in American history, operated out of a tiny 10 by 12 foot plywood cabin in the remote mountains of Montana. This was Ted Kaczynski, a former child prodigy who entered Harvard at age 16 and became the youngest mathematics professor in the history of UC Berkeley. But Kaczynski didn't want to solve equations. He wanted to destroy the industrial system. Between 1978 and 1995, he launched a meticulously calculated campaign of mail bombings, targeting computer scientists, airline executives, and geneticists, people he believed were the architects of a technological totalitarianism that was robbing humanity of its freedom. He became known to the FBI as Unabomb University and Airline Bomber. Kaczynski was a forensic ghost. He built his bombs entirely from scrap wood and metal, handcrafting his own bolts and switches to ensure there were no commercial parts that could be traced. He even went as far as to plant false clues, like hair from bus station floors, into his packages to mislead investigators. The FBI manhunt was the longest and most expensive in its history. but they were no closer to finding him until 1995, when Kaczynski made a fatal gamble. He sent a 350-word manifesto titled Industrial Society and Its Future to the New York Times and the Washington Post, promising to stop the bombings if they published it. The FBI, desperate for a lead, urged the papers to print it. It worked. In upstate New York, David Kaczynski recognized the specific linguistic patterns and anti-technology philosophy of his estranged brother. David made the agonizing decision to turn Ted in. When federal agents raided the Montana cabin in 1996, they found a live bomb ready to be mailed and 40,000 pages of journals detailing every crime. Ted Kaczynski's story is a terrifying case study in how extreme intelligence, when warped by social isolation and radical ideology, can turn a scholar into a cold-blooded killer. He remained unrepentant until his death in prison in 2023, leaving behind a legacy that still fuels debates about the dark side of the digital age. The Oklahoma City bombing, the day the heartland bleed, in the morning of April 19, 1995. Exactly 2 years after the fiery end of the Waco siege, the peace of a spring morning in Oklahoma City was shattered by the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in United States history. At 9:02 a.m., a rented Ryder truck packed with nearly 5,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer and fuel oil exploded in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. The blast was so powerful it was heard 30 miles away and registered 3.2 on the Richter scale. 1/3 of the 9-story building was instantly pulverized, pancaking floors on top of one another. The carnage was unimaginable. 168 people were killed, including 19 children who were in the building's daycare center. Detail that horrified the world. While initial rumors pointed toward Middle Eastern terrorists, the perpetrator was actually a decorated Gulf War veteran named Timothy McVeigh. Driven by a radical hatred of the federal government and a desire to avenge the standoffs at Ruby Ridge and Waco, McVeigh saw himself as a revolutionary soldier. His downfall was as mundane as his crime was monstrous. Just 90 minutes after the explosion, he was pulled over by a state trooper for driving a getaway car without a license plate. The trooper found a concealed weapon, and McVeigh was in jail before the FBI even knew he was their man. His serial conspirator, Terry Nichols, was eventually caught, but the scars on the American heartland remained deep. The bombing forced the nation to confront the reality of the militia movement and homegrown extremism. The site of the Murrah building is now a quiet memorial with 168 empty chairs, a haunting testament to a day when the anger of one man destroyed the lives of hundreds, proving that the greatest threats to a nation can sometimes come from within its own borders. September 11th, the day the world changed forever. In a crisp, clear Tuesday morning in September 2001, the course of human history was redirected in the span of 102 minutes. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. What initially appeared to be a horrific accident was revealed as a coordinated act of war when United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower 17 minutes later. For the first time in history, the entire world watched a mass casualty event unfold in real time on live television. The sheer scale of the destruction was unprecedented. The Twin Towers, symbols of American economic might, collapsed into a mountain of pulverized concrete and steel known as Ground Zero. A third plane struck the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, and a fourth, United Flight 93, crashed in a field in Pennsylvania after the passengers, learning of the other attacks via airphones, fought back against the hijackers. Nearly 3,000 people from over 90 countries were killed. The mastermind behind the attacks, Osama bin Laden, and his AI-keyed network had exploited the vulnerabilities of a globalized world to strike the heart of the lone superpower. The aftermath of 9/11 was a total restructuring of American life. The Department of Homeland Security was created. The TSA transformed air travel from a convenience into a high-security gauntlet, and the Patriot Act expanded government surveillance to levels never before seen in a democracy. America launched a war on terror, leading to the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, conflicts that would last 2 decades and cost trillions of dollars. But beyond the wars and the laws, 9/11 changed the American psyche. The feeling of invulnerability that had existed since the end of the Cold War vanished, replaced by a permanent state of anxiety and a debate over the balance between liberty and security that continues to this day. The digital frontier, the future of the past as the smoke cleared from the early 2000s, America and the world entered a second revolution, not one of steel and steam, but of silicon and fiber optics. The rise of the digital age represents the most rapid transformation of human behavior in history. In the late 1990s, the internet was a novelty. By 2010, it was an appendage. The introduction of the smartphone in 2007 by Steve Jobs acted as a singularity moment, condensing the sum of human knowledge, communication, and commerce into a device that fits in a pocket. However, this progress came with a dark underside. The same social media platforms that allowed for the Arab Spring also became tools for unprecedented information warfare, echo chambers, and the erosion of objective truth. We have moved from the yellow journalism of the 1890s to the deepfakes and algorithmic bias of the 2020s. Today, American history is being written in real time by data points and server farms. As we look back at the 18 parts of this journey, from the mothers mailing babies in 1913 to the secret bunkers of Area 51, and from the radioactive dust of the Manhattan Project to the digital clouds of Silicon Valley, we see a pattern. America is a nation of extremes, built on the tension between incredible innovation and profound tragedy. It is a country that constantly reinvents itself, often by breaking its own rules. As we stand on the edge of the age of artificial intelligence, the lessons of the past remain clear. History is not a straight line, but a chaotic, beautiful, and often terrifying circle. The boring history books were wrong. The story of the United States is the story of humanity's greatest dreams and its darkest impulses, all happening at the same time, at a breakneck speed that never truly stops.
The business plot, the secret fascist coup of 1933. While most Americans believe that the U.S. government has always been a stable democracy, there was a terrifying moment in 1933 when a group of the country's wealthiest industrialists allegedly plotted to overthrow President Franklin D. Roosevelt and install a fascist dictator. This event, known as the business plot, came to light thanks to one man, Smedley Butler, a retired Major General and two-time Medal of Honor recipient who was arguably the most respected military figure of his time. Butler claimed that he was approached by a group of powerful financiers who were furious with FDR's New Deal and his decision to take the U.S. off the gold standard. They feared Roosevelt was turning the country toward socialism and destroying their fortunes. According to Butler's testimony before Congress, these plotters offered him an army of 500,000 World War I veterans and millions of dollars in funding to lead a march on Washington, D.C. The goal was to force FDR to step aside or become a figurehead, while a Secretary of General Affairs, a dictator, took over the actual governance of the nation, modeled after the fascist regimes of Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany. Butler, a staunch patriot, pretended to go along with the plan to gather information and then immediately blew the whistle to the McCormack-Dickstein Committee. The investigation confirmed that such a plot was indeed being discussed and that the individuals involved had the means to carry it out. However, in a shocking display of political protection, none of the wealthy industrialists named by Butler, including representatives from major corporations and banking dynasties, were ever prosecuted. The media at the time largely mocked the story, calling it a giant hoax, but declassified documents decades later proved that the threat was very real. The business plot remains one of the most chilling what-if moments in American history, revealing that even the world's strongest democracy was once just one honest general away from becoming a fascist state. 1816, the year without a summer and the birth of monsters. In the early 19th century, the United States was a young nation still recovering from the War of 1812, but in 1816, it faced a catastrophe that came not from a human enemy, but from a volcano 10,000 miles away. In April 1815, Mount Tambora in modern-day Indonesia erupted in the largest volcanic event in recorded history. It sent a massive cloud of ash and sulfuric acid into the stratosphere, circling the globe and creating a volcanic winter. By 1816, the effect reached the American East Coast, and what followed was the year without a summer. In June and July, when temperatures should have been sweltering, massive snowstorms buried New England. Frost killed every crop in the ground, leading to a total agricultural collapse.
Food prices skyrocketed, and starving families were forced to eat porcupines and boiled nettles to survive. The sky was often a strange, eerie shade of red or gray due to the volcanic dust. This climate disaster triggered the first great westward migration, as thousands of desperate farmers abandoned their frozen lands in Vermont and Maine to head toward the Ohio River Valley, hoping for warmer soil. But the strangest legacy of 1816 wasn't just economic, it was cultural. In Europe, the cold, dark, and gloomy weather forced a group of writers, including Mary Shelley and Lord Byron, to stay indoors at a villa in Switzerland. To pass the time, they held a competition to see who could write the scariest story. This dismal, summerless atmosphere directly inspired Mary Shelley to write Frankenstein and John Polidori to write The Vampire, the first modern vampire story. Thus, a volcanic eruption in Indonesia created a famine in America and birthed the most iconic monsters in Western literature. It serves as a haunting reminder of how fragile human civilization is when faced with the overwhelming power of the natural world. The balloon tangle, the great airship scare of 1896, long before the tic-tac UFOs of the 21st century or the Roswell crash of 1947, America experienced its first massive wave of unidentified flying object sightings, but they weren't called UFOs back then. In late 1896 and early 1897, thousands of people across the United States, from California to Chicago, reported seeing massive, metallic airships floating silently in the night sky. This was years before the Wright brothers' first flight and at a time when the only flying technology available was the basic hot air balloon. These mystery airships were described as cigar-shaped, glowing with powerful searchlights, and capable of flying against the wind at incredible speeds. In some accounts, witnesses claimed to see human-like pilots leaning out of the ships, laughing or shouting down to the crowds below. In one famous but likely tall tale, from Aurora, Texas, locals claimed an airship crashed into a windmill, and they supposedly buried an alien pilot in the local cemetery. While many historians believe that Great Airship Scare was a mixture of mass hysteria, planet sightings, Venus, and creative journalism by bored newspaper editors, others suggest it was the secret testing of experimental dirigibles by a rogue inventor or a group like the legendary Sonora Aero Club. The scare vanished as quickly as it began, leaving behind a legacy of newspaper clippings that represent the first time the American public looked to the stars with a mixture of wonder and dread, wondering if they were truly alone in the universe. The mud flood, the hidden architecture of a lost civilization. In recent years, a bizarre and sprawling conspiracy theory has taken over corners of the internet, claiming that American history, and indeed world history, is a total fabrication. This is the mud flood or Tartarian Empire theory. Proponents of this idea point to the grand, neoclassical architecture found in cities like Washington, D.C., Chicago, and San Francisco, buildings with massive stone columns, intricate domes, and basement windows that sit half-buried in the dirt. They argue that these buildings weren't built by 19th-century pioneers with horse and buggy technology, but were instead inherited from a highly advanced, global civilization called Tartaria that was wiped out by a global mud flood in the mid-1800s. According to this narrative, the massive World's Fairs, such as the 1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exposition, weren't actually built to showcase progress. They were the temporary unveiling of existing Tartarian cities before they were systematically demolished to hide the truth of the old world. While mainstream historians explain these half-windows as standard architectural designs for light and ventilation in basements, and the World's Fairs as temporary structures made of staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp, the mud flood believers insist that a massive Great Reset occurred. They claim that the historical timeline was rewritten by the winners of a forgotten war to make it seem like the Industrial Revolution was a new invention, rather than a recovery of lost high technology like free atmospheric energy. While scientifically debunked, the mud flood theory represents a deep-seated American fascination with the idea that our cities hold ancient secrets and that the ground beneath our feet is literally hiding an alternative reality. The Great Train Wreck of 1918, the death of the Iron Horses. As America was fully mobilizing for World War I, the nation's infrastructure was pushed to its absolute breaking point, leading to the deadliest rail accident in U.S. history. On the morning of July 9, 1918, in Nashville, Tennessee, Two massive passenger trains were hurtling toward each other on a single-track section known as Dutchman's Curve. Train number 4 was heading east toward Nashville, while train number 1 was heading west toward Memphis, carrying hundreds of laborers, many of whom were African Americans traveling to work at a nearby munitions plant. Due to a series of catastrophic communication failures, the crew of the westbound train mistakenly believed the eastbound train had already passed. In reality, the eastbound train was running late. At 7:20 a.m., the two steam engines collided head-on at a combined speed of over 100 miles per hour. The impact was so violent that it was heard miles away. The wooden passenger cars, known as coffin cars, splintered into millions of toothpicks upon impact. The massive iron boilers exploded, showering the survivors in scalding steam and burning coal. Rescuers arrived to find a scene of absolute carnage, with bodies thrown into the nearby cornfields and the wreckage piled several stories high. The official death toll was 101, but because record-keeping for the black laborers was poor at the time, many believe the actual number of victims was much higher. This disaster forced the American railroad industry to finally abandon wooden passenger cars in favor of all-steel construction and led to the implementation of automated signaling systems. It remains a somber chapter in the history of American industrialization, a reminder that the Iron Age was built on a foundation of human sacrifice and mechanical error. The 1938 War of the Worlds, the night the radio lied on the night of October 30, 1938, Halloween Eve, the American public experienced the most famous instance of mass media panic in history. A young Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater on the air began a radio broadcast that sounded like a standard music program, only to be interrupted by increasingly frantic news bulletins. The bulletins described a mysterious, flaming object landing on a farm in Grover's Mill, New Jersey. As the broadcast continued, actors playing reporters screamed in terror as they witnessed giant Martian machines emerging from the canisters, incinerating the local militia with heat rays and releasing poisonous black gas. Despite several announcements that the program was a fictional adaptation of H.G. Wells' novel, thousands of listeners who tuned in late believed they were hearing a real-time alien invasion. Panic swept across the country. People fled their homes with wet towels over their faces to protect against gas. Traffic jams clogged the roads out of New Jersey, and some people reportedly contemplated suicide rather than be captured by Martians. The event proved the terrifying power of the relatively new medium of radio and showed how easily the public could be manipulated by a convincing narrative. It was a precursor to the fake news of the modern era and remains a legendary moment where the line between entertainment and reality vanished for an entire nation. The Georgia Guidestones, the American Stonehenge and the New World Order. In June 1979, a man using the pseudonym R.C. Christian approached the Elberton Granite Finishing Company in Georgia with a request that would baffle the world for over 40 years. He wanted to build a massive monument of 6 granite slabs, standing 19 feet tall and weighing over 230,000 pounds. The monument, which became known as the Georgia Guidestones, featured 10 guidelines for a future age of reason, etched in 8 different languages: English, Spanish, Swahili, Hindi, Hebrew, Arabic, traditional Chinese, and Russian. The instructions were chilling to some and utopian to others, beginning with the controversial command to maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. Because this would require the death of 90% of the current population, the Guidestones became a lightning rod for conspiracy theorists who claimed they were a blueprint for a new world order or a satanic global elite planning a mass cull of humanity. The monument also functioned as an astronomical calendar. A hole bored through the center stone allowed the North Star to be seen at all times, and a slot aligned with the solstices and equinoxes. For decades, the identity of R.C. Christian remained a secret, though many suspected he represented a group of wealthy Rosicrucians or eugenicists. The mystery took a violent turn in July 2022, when an explosive device was detonated at the site, partially destroying the monument. For safety reasons, the local government demolished the remaining pillars just hours later. The destruction of the Guidestones didn't end the conspiracy, it only deepened it, leaving behind an empty field and a million unanswered questions about who built them and why they wanted the world to change so drastically. Project Azorian, the greatest underwater heist in history. In 1968, a Soviet Golf-class ballistic missile submarine, the K-129, sank to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, nearly 3 miles deep. While the Soviet Navy searched in vain, the American CIA used a secret network of underwater microphones to pinpoint the exact location. Realizing the submarine contained codebooks and nuclear warheads that could win the Cold War, the U.S. launched Project Azorian, one of the most ambitious and expensive intelligence operations ever conceived. To keep the mission secret, the CIA enlisted the help of reclusive billionaire Howard Hughes. Together, they built a massive ship called the Hughes Glomar Explorer, telling the world it was a deep-sea mining vessel intended to extract manganese nodules from the ocean floor. In reality, the ship was equipped with a giant mechanical claw, nicknamed Clementine, designed to reach down 16,000 feet and pull the entire 2,000-ton submarine to the surface. In 1974, in total secrecy, the mission was executed. As the claw began lifting the K-129, disaster struck, the submarine broke apart. Two-thirds of the sub, including the precious codebooks, plummeted back to the abyss. However, the CIA did manage to recover a portion containing 2 nuclear torpedoes and the bodies of 6 Soviet sailors, whom they buried at sea with full military honors in a ceremony filmed and kept secret for years. The mission cost over $800 million, nearly $4 billion today, and was only revealed to the public after a break-in at Howard Hughes' office led to a leak. It remains a testament to the sheer audacity of American espionage, proving that the U.S. was willing to move the very bottom of the ocean to gain an advantage over its rivals. The 1962 Great Ghost Blimp mystery of the L-8. During the height of World War II, America was on high alert for Japanese submarines off the west coast. On August 16, 1942, a Navy blimp, the L-8, took off from Treasure Island in San Francisco for a routine patrol with 2 experienced pilots, Ernest Cody and Charles Adams. A few hours into the flight, the blimp was spotted by a passing ship and several witnesses as it drifted strangely toward the shore. When the blimp finally crashed into a suburban street in Daly City, rescuers rushed to the gondola to save the pilots. To their horror, the door was latched open, but the cabin was empty. The radio was working, the parachutes and life rafts were still on board, and even the pilots' hats were resting on the dashboard. There were no signs of a struggle, and the engines were in perfect working order. The pilots had simply vanished into thin air while flying over the ocean. Despite a massive search, no trace of Cody or Adams was ever found. Theories ranged from a Japanese kidnapping to a secret experiment gone wrong, but the ghost blimp mystery remains officially unsolved. It is one of the strangest disappearances in military history, a reminder that even in the middle of a world-spanning war, some mysteries are purely local and hauntingly silent. The 1916 Jersey Shore shark attacks, the summer of terror. Before 1916, the American public generally believed that sharks were harmless scavengers that wouldn't attack a human. Scientists of the era even claimed that a shark's jaw wasn't strong enough to sever a human limb. That illusion was shattered during a 12-day heatwave in July 1916, when a series of shark attacks along the coast of New Jersey left 4 people dead and 1 seriously injured. The terror began at Beach Haven, where a young man was killed in plain sight of beachgoers. 5 days later, another man was attacked 45 miles north at Spring Lake. But the most terrifying turn occurred when the shark moved away from the ocean and traveled miles inland into Matawan Creek, a narrow, freshwater stream where local children played. Despite warnings, a group of boys went swimming. A shark pulled 11-year-old Lester Stillwell underwater. A local businessman, Watson Fisher, dove in to recover the boy's body but was himself attacked and bled to death. The events triggered a nationwide panic that bordered on war. Armed posses patrolled the beaches with shotguns and dynamite, and President Woodrow Wilson even called a special cabinet meeting to deal with the shark problem. This event fundamentally changed the way humans perceived the ocean and directly inspired Peter Benchley to write Jaws. It remains a chilling reminder that nature can invade our safe spaces at any moment, turning a summer vacation into a bloodbath. The Winchester Mystery House, a mansion built by ghosts. In San Jose, California, stands one of the most bizarre architectural feats in the world, a sprawling, 160-room Queen and style Victorian mansion known as the Winchester Mystery House. It was the residence of Sarah Winchester, the widow of William Wirt Winchester and heiress to the Winchester repeating arms fortune. After the untimely deaths of her husband and infant daughter, Sarah visited a medium who told her that she was haunted by the spirits of everyone killed by the gun that won the West. The medium claimed that to appease these ghosts, Sarah had to move west and build a house for them, and as long as construction never stopped, she would stay alive. Sarah took this advice literally. For 38 years, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, construction crews worked on the house. Because Sarah didn't use an architect, the house became a labyrinth of madness. It features stairs that lead directly into the ceiling, doors that open onto 3-story drops, and chimneys that stop just short of the roof. Sarah was obsessed with the number 13. Almost all the windows have 13 panes, and many of the ceilings have 13 panels. She supposedly slept in a different room every night to confuse the evil spirits. When she died in 1922, the carpenters stopped working mid-sentence, leaving nails half-driven into the walls. Today, the house is a massive maze that stands as a monument to grief, guilt, and the terrifying power of superstition. The 1925 Great Serum Run, the real Balto story. While America is often associated with the heat of the South or the industry of the East, its most heroic story took place in the frozen wilderness of Alaska. In January 1925, a deadly outbreak of diphtheria threatened the isolated town of Nome. The town's only doctor realized that his supply of antitoxin had expired, and a new shipment was stuck 1,000 miles away in Anchorage. With the ports frozen solid and the primitive plains of the era grounded by a massive blizzard, the only hope was a relay of dog sled teams. Over 20 mushers and 150 dogs braved temperatures of -60°F and hurricane-force winds to transport the medicine across the treacherous Iditarod Trail. The journey, which normally took 25 days, was completed in a record-breaking 5.5 days. While a dog named Balto became the face of the event with a statue in Central Park, many historians argue that the real hero was a dog named Togo, who ran the longest and most dangerous leg of the journey, nearly 260 miles through a whiteout. The Great Race of Mercy captivated the world via radio and saved the children of Nome from certain death. It remains the ultimate example of the bond between humans and animals and the rugged endurance required to survive on the American frontier. The Roanoke Colony, the vanishing of the first Americans. Long before the Pilgrims set foot on Plymouth Rock, there was Roanoke. In 1587, a group of 115 English settlers, led by John White, arrived on an island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. This was intended to be the first permanent English settlement in the New World. Among them was Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. However, the colony struggled with poor relations with local tribes and a lack of supplies. John White was forced to sail back to England for help, but his return was delayed for 3 long years by the outbreak of the Anglo-Spanish War. When he finally returned to Roanoke in 1590, he found a scene that has baffled historians for over 4 centuries. The settlement was completely deserted. There were no signs of a struggle, no bodies, and no burnt ruins. The houses had been carefully dismantled, not destroyed. The only clues left behind were 2 words carved into wooden posts, Croton, and the letters CRO. White had previously instructed the colonists to carve a cross if they were leaving under duress, but no cross was found. He believed they had moved to Croton Island, now Hatteras Island, to live with the friendly Croatan tribe, but a massive storm forced his ship back to England before he could investigate. Theories have ranged from a massacre by rival tribes to the settlers being lost at sea while trying to sail home. However, modern DNA testing of local populations suggests a more likely, yet less mysterious, end: the starving settlers simply assimilated into the local indigenous tribes to survive. Yet, the legend of the lost colony remains a haunting ghost story at the very beginning of American history, a reminder that the New World was a place where entire civilizations could vanish into the forest without a trace. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the day the earth split. At 5:12 a.m. on April 18, 1906, the residents of San Francisco were jolted awake by a massive rupture along the San Andreas Fault. For nearly a minute, the ground buckled and heaved. The earthquake, estimated at a magnitude of 7.9, was so powerful it was felt from southern Oregon to Los Angeles. But the shaking was only the beginning. The quake ruptured the city's water mains, leaving firefighters helpless as dozens of small fires, sparked by broken gas lines and overturned stoves, merged into a massive firestorm. For 3 days, the city burned. In a desperate and controversial move, the military attempted to create fire breaks by dynamiting entire blocks of historic buildings, which often only served to spread the flames further. The heat was so intense it melted glass and warped steel. When the smoke finally cleared, more than 80% of San Francisco was in ruins, and over 3,000 people were dead, though the government initially downplayed the number to avoid discouraging investment. Over 250,000 people were left homeless, living in tent cities in Golden Gate Park. This disaster was a turning point for American science. It led to the first major geological studies of the San Andreas Fault and birthed the modern field of seismology. It also showcased the incredible resilience of the American spirit, as the city was rebuilt with breathtaking speed, hosting a World's Fair just 9 years later. However, the 1906 quake remains a terrifying reminder that some of America's greatest cities are built on a foundation of shifting tectonic plates, waiting for the big one to return. The 1848 Gold Rush, the madness of the 49ers. In January 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall found a few shiny flakes of metal in the American River at Sutter's Mill in California. He tried to keep it a secret, but the news spread like a wildfire, triggering the greatest mass migration in American history. Within a year, 300,000 people from all over the world, known as 49ers, poured into California, abandoning their families, farms, and jobs for a chance at instant wealth. San Francisco transformed from a tiny village of 200 people into a booming metropolis of 36,000 in just months. Ships were abandoned in the harbor by their crews, who headed for the hills to mine. The gold rush was a period of lawlessness, greed, and extreme hardship. While a few struck it rich, most found only debt and disease. The real winners were the merchants of the miners, like Levi Strauss, who made a fortune selling durable denim pants to men working in the mud. The gold rush accelerated California's statehood and connected the east and west coasts, but it came at a devastating cost to the indigenous populations, who were displaced or massacred in the chaos. It cemented the get-rich-quick mentality in the American DNA, a dream that would drive the nation's economy for the next century and beyond. The Villisca Axe murders, the shadow in the house. On the quiet night of June 10, 1912, in the small town of Villisca, Iowa, a crime was committed that remains one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries in American history. 8 people, Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, their 4 children, and 2 young houseguests, were bludgeoned to death in their sleep with an axe. The killer had hidden in the attic, waiting for the family to return from church and fall asleep. What makes this case truly haunting is the killer's behavior after the murders. They didn't just flee, they systematically went through the house, covering every mirror with cloth and putting a piece of uneaten bacon next to the axe. The victims' faces were covered with bed sheets, and all the doors were locked from the inside. Despite a decade of investigations, several high-profile trials, and even the involvement of a famous private detective from the Burns Agency, no one was ever convicted. Suspects ranged from a traveling preacher with a history of mental illness to a hired hitman sent by a business rival. The Villisca Axe House still stands today, preserved exactly as it was, and is considered one of the most haunted places in the United States. It is a grim reminder that in the early 20th century, before forensic science and DNA, a monster could walk into a happy home and vanish into the night, leaving an entire community paralyzed by fear for generations. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, the water that broke the South. In the spring of 1927, after months of record-breaking rain, the mighty Mississippi River literally exploded out of its banks. This was not a normal flood, it was a hydraulic apocalypse. Levees from Illinois to Louisiana burst, flooding 27,000 square miles, an area roughly the size of 4 New England states combined. In some places, the water was 30 feet deep. The flood displaced over 700,000 people and killed hundreds, but the tragedy was compounded by extreme social injustice. In the Jim Crow South, African American refugees were often forced to work on the levees at gunpoint and were held in concentration camps on top of the levees, where they were denied food and medicine unless they agreed to stay and work for the white landowners after the water receded. This disaster had massive political consequences. It destroyed the presidency of Calvin Coolidge and propelled Herbert Hoover, who managed the relief efforts, to the White House. More importantly, it triggered a massive wave of the Great Migration, as thousands of black families abandoned the South for northern cities like Chicago and Detroit, forever changing the cultural and musical landscape of America. The 1927 flood proved that nature doesn't just destroy buildings, it can reshape the soul of a nation. The 1945 Flight 19 mystery, the birth of the Bermuda Triangle. On December 5, 1945, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers took off from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, for a routine training mission known as Flight 19. The weather was clear, and the pilots were experienced. However, a few hours into the flight, the mission leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, radioed that his compasses were failing and that they were lost. "Everything is wrong, even the ocean doesn't look as it should," he reportedly said. As the sun set and the weather turned, the 5 planes vanished. A massive search and rescue operation was launched, including a PBM Mariner flying boat with a crew of 13. Within 20 minutes, the rescue plane also disappeared. No wreckage, no oil slick, and no bodies were ever found. This event became the cornerstone of the Bermuda Triangle legend. While the Navy officially attributed the loss to causes or reasons unknown, skeptics point to pilot disorientation and bad weather. Regardless of the cause, the vanishing of 6 aircraft and 27 men in a single afternoon remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the Atlantic, fueling decades of theories about magnetic anomalies, time slips, and extraterrestrial intervention. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, the price of progress. In 1911, New York City was a city of soaring skyscrapers and crushing poverty, a place where the Industrial Revolution was being built on the backs of young immigrant women. On March 25, a fire broke out on the 8th floor of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, near Washington Square Park. Within minutes, the top 3 floors of the building were a furnace. The workers, mostly teenage girls from Italy and Eastern Europe, rushed to the exits, only to find a terrifying reality. The factory owners had locked the fire escape doors to prevent the girls from taking unauthorized breaks or stealing scraps of fabric. As the flames closed in, the world watched in horror as dozens of girls began jumping from the 9th floor windows to avoid being burned alive. The fire department's ladders were too short to reach them, and the safety nets tore like paper under the weight of the falling bodies. In total, 146 people died in just 18 minutes. The tragedy ignited a massive wave of strikes and led to the creation of the International Ladies' Garment Workers Union. It forced the government to pass some of the first comprehensive labor and fire safety laws in American history, transforming the workplace from a death trap into a regulated environment. The Triangle Fire remains a somber reminder that the American dream was often bought with the lives of those who were never given a seat at the table. The Somerton Man, the American spy connection? In December 1948, the body of an unidentified man was found on Somerton Beach in Australia. He was perfectly dressed in a suit, but every single label had been carefully cut out of his clothing. In a secret pocket, investigators found a tiny scrap of paper with the Persian words, Tamam shud, meaning it is finished. This led them to a rare copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which contained a secret code that has never been fully broken. For decades, the case was a total mystery, but recent DNA evidence and declassified files suggest a startling American connection. Many believe that Somerton Man was a high-level spy caught in the early crossfire of the Cold War, possibly linked to American intelligence operations at the nearby Woomera missile testing range. The level of sanitization of his identity suggests a professional cleaner was involved, and his proximity to top-secret technology has led historians to believe he was part of a failed handoff between US and Australian assets. While he was recently identified as an Australian engineer named Carl Webb, the question of why he was carrying a secret code and who was trying to erase him remains one of the most intriguing ghost stories of the Cold War, a reminder that the world of espionage is often hidden in plain sight. The 1978 Jonestown Massacre, the jungle of no return. While it occurred in Guyana, the Jonestown Massacre was a purely American tragedy. Jim Jones, a charismatic preacher from Indiana, moved his People's Temple to the jungle of South America to escape government persecution and build a socialist utopia. But the utopia quickly turned into a concentration camp. In November 1978, after a U.S. congressman, Leo Ryan, was murdered while investigating reports of abuse, Jones ordered his followers to commit revolutionary suicide. Over 900 people, including 300 children, died after drinking cyanide-laced punch. It was the largest loss of American civilian life in a non-natural disaster until 9/11. The phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid, entered the American lexicon as a dark reminder of the power of cult personality and the terrifying result of blind obedience. It remains a haunting chapter in the history of American religious movements, proving that the search for a perfect world can sometimes lead directly to hell. The Bonus Army March, betrayal of the Patriots. In the summer of 1932, at the height of the Great Depression, Washington, D.C. witnessed a scene that looked like a civil war. Over 17,000 World War I veterans, calling themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, marched on the Capitol. They were desperate, hungry, and homeless, demanding the immediate payment of bonus certificates promised to them for their service, which weren't scheduled to be paid until 1945. They set up a massive Hooverville, a shantytown, in the Anacostia Flats, bringing their wives and children with them, living in huts made of scrap wood and cardboard. President Herbert Hoover, fearing a communist revolution, ordered the military to clear the camps. In a shocking turn of events, the current military leaders, General Douglas MacArthur, assisted by Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton, led regular army troops, cavalry, and 6 tanks against the veterans. The soldiers used tear gas and bayonets to drive the veterans out, and then burned the shantytown to the ground. Images of the U.S. Army attacking its own war heroes horrified the nation and virtually guaranteed Hoover's defeat in the next election. It remains a dark stain on American history, a moment when the government turned its weapons on the very men who had fought to protect it, proving that even the most sacred bonds of service can be broken by political fear. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, Science Without a Soul. While the world was horrified by the medical experiments of the Nazis, a similarly depraved study was being conducted by the United States Public Health Service on its own citizens. Starting in 1932, the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male followed 600 black sharecroppers in Alabama. The men were told they were being treated for bad blood, but in reality, the scientists wanted to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis until death. For 40 years, the government lied to these men. Even after penicillin was discovered as a proven cure in the 1940s, the researchers actively prevented the participants from receiving treatment, even going so far as to notify local doctors not to treat them. The men were given placebos, like aspirin and mineral supplements, while the disease slowly destroyed their bodies, leading to blindness, insanity, and death. The study only stopped in 1972 when a whistleblower, Peter Buxton, leaked the story to the press. By then, dozens of men had died, wives had been infected, and children had been born with congenital syphilis. This experiment remains the primary reason for a deep-seated and justified distrust of the medical establishment among African Americans. It forced the creation of modern bioethics and the institutional review boards that protect human subjects today, but the damage to the American social fabric was permanent and devastating. The 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, the burning of Black Wall Street. On May 31, 1921, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as Black Wall Street, was one of the wealthiest African American communities in the United States, home to luxury hotels, banks, and private doctors. But in less than 24 hours, it was erased from the map. Following a disputed encounter between a black teenager and a white elevator operator, a massive white mob, some of whom were deputized by city officials, invaded the district. They didn't just shoot. They used private airplanes to drop firebombs from the sky, a rare instance of an American city being bombed from the air. Over 35 square blocks were burned to ash, 10,000 people were left homeless, and it is estimated that up to 300 people were murdered. The event was so shameful that it was scrubbed from history books for decades, and many survivors were too traumatized to speak of it until the late 20th century. Tulsa remains a chilling example of how quickly prosperity can be destroyed by racial hatred and how history can be intentionally hidden by the people who write it. The 1964 Great Alaskan Earthquake, the day the Earth liquefied. On Good Friday, March 27, 1964, the largest earthquake in North American history, and the second largest ever recorded, struck the Prince William Sound region of Alaska. Measuring a staggering 9.2 on the Richter scale, the shaking lasted for an excruciating 4 minutes and 38 seconds. To put that in perspective, most major earthquakes last only 30 seconds. The power of the quake was so immense that it caused the ground in parts of Anchorage to literally liquefy, a process called soil liquefaction where solid earth turns into a quicksand-like mush. Entire neighborhoods, like Tunigan Heights, slid into the sea as the bluffs they were built on collapsed. The vertical displacement was so massive that some areas of the coast were raised by 30 feet, while others dropped by 8 feet. But the earthquake was only the beginning. The resulting tsunamis devastated coastal towns as far away as California and Hawaii. In the town of Valdez, the harbor was literally sucked dry before a 30-foot wall of water surged back, obliterating the docks and killing 32 people instantly. This event was a landmark for science, because it was the first time such a massive quake was recorded by a modern global network of seismographs. It provided the definitive proof for the then controversial theory of plate tectonics. It showed that the Earth's crust was not a solid shell, but a series of moving plates that could slide under one another in subduction zones. The 1964 quake redefined our understanding of the planet's power, proving that in less than 5 minutes, the very map of the world can be rewritten. The lead masks mystery, science, seance, or spies. In August 1966, on Vintam Hill in Brazil, a young boy flying a kite stumbled upon 2 bodies that would launch one of the most bizarre investigations in history. The men, Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana, were 2 electronic technicians from a nearby town. They were found dressed in formal suits and raincoats, lying neatly side by side. There were no signs of a struggle and no obvious cause of death. But the strangest part was what was on their faces. Both men were wearing handmade lead masks, the kind used to protect eyes from radiation. Next to them was a notebook containing instructions that sounded like a ritualistic experiment. 1630 at the agreed place. 1830 swallow capsules, after effect protect metals weight for mask signal. What was the mask signal? What were the capsules? No toxicological report could find poison, but the bodies were found in a high state of decomposition. The men were known to be scientific spiritualists, obsessed with trying to contact extraterrestrials or spirits using electronic equipment. Some believe they were lured to the hill by a cult, others think they were trying to witness a radioactive event that they believed would open a portal. The lead masks case remains a chilling example of what happens when the lines between fringe science, occultism, and technology become blurred, leaving behind a scene that looks more like a science fiction movie than a police report. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, the mountain that blew sideways. For months in early 1980, the state of Washington watched as Mount St. Helens began to bulge and steam. Geologists warned of an eruption, but nobody predicted exactly how it would happen. On May 18, a massive earthquake triggered the largest landslide in recorded history, removing the entire northern face of the mountain. With the lid gone, the volcano didn't erupt upward, it erupted sideways in a lateral blast. A 300-mile-per-hour wall of superheated ash and stone pulverized everything in its path, flattening 230 square miles of ancient forest like they were toothpicks. 57 people were killed, including geologist David Johnston, whose final words over the radio were, "Vancouver. Vancouver. This is it." The ash cloud rose 80,000 feet into the air, turning day into pitch-black night across 3 states and eventually circling the entire globe. The eruption was a humbling reminder that despite all our technology, we are still living at the mercy of a living, breathing planet that can reclaim its territory in a matter of seconds. The Dyatlov Pass incident, the terror at Dead Mountain. In February 1959, 9 experienced hikers led by Igor Dyatlov disappeared in the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. When search parties finally found their camp on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, Dead Mountain, they found a scene that defied all logic. Their tent had been sliced open from the inside, and the hikers had fled into the sub-zero night without their coats, boots, or gear. Some were wearing only socks or underwear. Their bodies were found scattered hundreds of yards away. While some died of hypothermia, others had sustained horrific internal injuries comparable to a high-speed car crash, shattered ribs and fractured skulls, yet with no external bruising or soft tissue damage. Stranger still, 2 of the victims were missing their eyes and 1 was missing her tongue. For decades, theories ranged from secret Soviet weapon tests and infrasound causing madness to Yeti attacks and alien abductions. However, recent forensic research suggests a perfect storm of physics, a rare type of delayed slab avalanche combined with the hikers' desperate attempts to survive in a ravine. Yet, the mystery of why they fled in such a panic and why their clothes allegedly showed traces of radiation remains a cornerstone of global conspiracy lore. It is the ultimate survival horror story, a reminder that the wilderness holds secrets that can crush even the most prepared human spirits. The 1918 Spanish flu, the silent global executioner. As World War I was coming to a bloody end, a far more lethal enemy was quietly boarding troop ships. The 1918 influenza pandemic, misleadingly named the Spanish flu, was the deadliest natural disaster in human history. Unlike typical flus that kill the elderly and the young, this strain triggered a cytokine storm in the immune systems of healthy 20 to 40-year-olds, essentially turning their own bodies against them. People would wake up healthy and be dead by nightfall, their skin turning blue or purple as they suffocated from fluid in their lungs. In the United States, the virus was accelerated by massive war bond parades. In Philadelphia, a single parade led to thousands of deaths within days. To hide the scale of the tragedy and keep morale high during the war, newspapers in the US and Europe were censored, while neutral Spain reported the truth, hence the name. In just over a year, the virus infected 1/3 of the global population and killed an estimated 50 to 100 million people, more than both world wars combined. The pandemic forced the creation of modern public health systems and the concept of social distancing, yet it remained a forgotten tragedy for decades, buried under the trauma of the war. It serves as a haunting blueprint for modern global crises, proving that a microscopic organism can bring the most powerful empires on Earth to their knees. The 1929 Great Stock Market Crash, the day the music stopped. For most of the 1920s, the American economy seemed invincible. The Roaring Twenties were fueled by easy credit, new technology, and a stock market that only went up. But on Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, the speculative bubble finally burst. In a single day of panic selling, billions of dollars were erased. Wealthy investors lost everything in hours. Legend has it that some were so distraught they jumped from the windows of their Wall Street offices. This wasn't just a bad day for bankers, it triggered a domino effect that closed thousands of banks, wiping out the life savings of ordinary families. The resulting Great Depression saw unemployment soar to 25%, with bread lines stretching for blocks in major cities. The crash ended the decade-long party and forced a total reimagining of the American government's role in the economy, leading to the New Deal and the social safety nets we have today. It remains the ultimate cautionary tale of greed and the fragility of the financial systems that govern our lives. The Hindenburg disaster, the death of the sky giants. By May 1937, the German airship Hindenburg was the absolute pinnacle of luxury travel, the Titanic of the skies. It was a massive, silver behemoth, over 800 feet long, floating over the Atlantic like a dream of the future. But this dream carried a fatal flaw. Because the United States held a monopoly on helium and refused to sell it to Nazi Germany, the Hindenburg was filled with 7 million cubic feet of highly flammable hydrogen. On the evening of May 6, as the airship attempted to dock at Lakehurst, New Jersey, amid a thunderstorm, something went catastrophically wrong. A spark, possibly caused by static electricity or a leak in the fabric, ignited the hydrogen. In just 34 seconds, the world's largest aircraft turned into a roaring pillar of fire and crashed to the ground. The event was immortalized by the live radio broadcast of reporter Herbert Morrison, whose sobbing voice famously cried, "Oh, the humanity." While only 36 people died, a miracle considering the size of the fire, the disaster was caught on newsreel cameras and shown in theaters globally. This visual evidence of the vulnerability of airships effectively killed the industry overnight. The Hindenburg remains a haunting symbol of the end of an era, a reminder that even the most majestic human inventions can be erased by a single, tiny spark. The Mothman, the harbinger of Point Pleasant. In the mid-1960s, the small town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, became the epicenter of one of the most terrifying and unexplained paranormal events in American history. Starting in November 1966, dozens of residents began reporting sightings of a massive, man-sized creature with 10-foot wings and glowing red eyes. They called it the Mothman. The creature was often seen near an abandoned World War II explosives manufacturing site known as the TNT area. Along with the sightings came reports of men in black visiting witnesses, strange lights in the sky, and terrifying premonitions of disaster. The hysteria reached a breaking point on December 15, 1967. During the rush-hour commute, the Silver Bridge, which connected Point Pleasant to Ohio, suddenly collapsed into the freezing Ohio River, killing 46 people. After the tragedy, the Mothman sightings stopped as abruptly as they had begun. Many believe the creature was a harbinger, a supernatural warning of the impending bridge collapse, while others link it to secret government experiments or even extraterrestrial activity. The Mothman legend transformed Point Pleasant into a destination for the strange, proving that sometimes, the most boring, small towns can hide the most haunting mysteries. The 1971 Stanford Prison Experiment, The Dark Side of Authority. In the basement of the Stanford University Psychology Building, a young professor named Philip Zimbardo set out to study the psychological effects of perceived power. He recruited 24 healthy male students and randomly assigned them to be either prisoners or guards in a simulated prison environment. What was supposed to be a 2-week study had to be shut down after only 6 days because it descended into absolute chaos and cruelty. The guards quickly became sadistic, subjected the prisoners to psychological torture, forced them to sleep on concrete, and humiliated them. The prisoners began to have emotional breakdowns and attempted a revolt. Most terrifyingly, Zimbardo himself became so absorbed in his role as superintendent that he failed to stop the abuse until a colleague intervened. The experiment proved a chilling point, that otherwise good people can become monsters when given absolute power and a uniform. It remains a cornerstone of social psychology and a warning about the fragility of human morality when placed within a broken system. The 1888 blizzard, the Great White Hurricane. Before the era of modern weather forecasting and GPS, a single storm could paralyze an entire coast. In March 1888, the Great White Hurricane struck the northeastern United States with terrifying speed. In a matter of hours, temperatures dropped from mild spring levels to below zero. The storm dumped nearly 50 inches of snow in parts of New York and Connecticut, with wind gusts of 80 miles per hour creating snowdrifts as high as second-story windows. New York City was completely shut down, the elevated trains were frozen on the tracks, telegraph lines were snapped, and over 200 ships were grounded or wrecked in the harbor. People died in the streets just steps from their front doors, unable to navigate the blinding whiteout. Over 400 people perished in the freeze. This disaster was the catalyst for moving the city's infrastructure underground, leading directly to the creation of the New York City subway system. It was a brutal reminder that even our greatest cities are at the mercy of the atmosphere's sudden fury. The Mary Celeste, the ghost ship of the Atlantic. In the annals of maritime history, no mystery is more enduring or more unsettling than that of the Mary Celeste. In December 1872, a British brigantine named the Dei Grazia was sailing through the choppy waters of the Atlantic toward the Strait of Gibraltar when the crew spotted a ship drifting aimlessly. It was the Mary Celeste, which had left New York City a month earlier. When the sailors boarded the vessel, they found a scene that felt frozen in time. The ship was in seaworthy condition, the cargo of 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol was intact, and there was plenty of food and water for 6 months. However, the captain, Benjamin Briggs, his wife, their young daughter, and the entire 7-man crew were gone. The only lifeboat was missing, and a frayed rope was trailing behind the ship. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no evidence of a pirate attack. The last entry in the captain's log was dated 10 days earlier, placing them hundreds of miles away from where the ship was found. For over a century, theories have ranged from giant squid attacks and alien abductions to a seaquake or a sudden fear that the alcohol cargo was about to explode. The most likely theory is that a faulty pump led the captain to believe the ship was sinking, causing a panicked and unnecessary evacuation into the lifeboat, which was then lost at sea. Yet, the image of a perfectly functioning ship sailing the ocean with no one at the helm remains the ultimate Marie Celeste of the sea, a reminder that the ocean is a vast, indifferent void that can swallow human lives without leaving a single clue behind. The 1920 Wall Street bombing, terror at the corner of fortune. Long before the tragedies of the modern era, Wall Street experienced a day of carnage that was largely scrubbed from the collective American memory. On September 16, 1920, just as the lunch hour began, a nondescript horse-drawn wagon pulled up in front of the J.P. Morgan Bank building at the busiest corner in New York City. The driver stepped away, and minutes later, the wagon exploded. It was packed with 100 pounds of dynamite and 500 pounds of heavy iron slugs, designed to act as shrapnel. The blast was so powerful it shattered windows for blocks and sent a wall of fire through the streets. 38 people were killed instantly, and hundreds were maimed. The victims weren't the wealthy bankers, who were mostly tucked away in their back offices, but the messengers, stenographers, and clerks who were out on the sidewalk. Despite an intense investigation by the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor to the FBI, the perpetrators were never caught. The leading theory was that Italian anarchists, seeking revenge for the arrest of Sacco and Vanzetti, had planted the bomb. The pockmarks and shrapnel scars from the blast are still visible on the stone walls of the 23 Wall Street building today, a permanent, physical scar of the first major terrorist attack on the American homeland. It was a chilling introduction to the 20th century, proving that even the most fortified centers of wealth are vulnerable to the hidden anger of the masses. The 1932 Lindbergh kidnapping, the crime of the century. In the early 1930s, Charles Lindbergh was the most famous man on the planet, a hero who had conquered the Atlantic alone. But his fame became a curse on the night of March 1, 1932, when his 20-month-old son, Charlie Jr., was snatched from his nursery in their secluded New Jersey home. The kidnapper used a homemade wooden ladder to reach the second-story window, leaving behind a ransom note demanding $50,000. For 10 weeks, the entire nation was paralyzed with anxiety, and the case became a media circus. Lindbergh himself took charge of the investigation, communicating with the kidnappers through strange intermediaries. Despite paying the ransom in gold certificates, the baby's body was found 2 months later in a shallow grave just a few miles from the house. He had died from a fractured skull on the night of the abduction. 2 years later, a German immigrant named Bruno Richard Hauptmann was caught after he used one of the ransom bills at a gas station. He was convicted and executed in what became known as the trial of the century, though many still debate his guilt and the possibility of an inside job. The kidnapping led to the Lindbergh Law, making kidnapping a federal crime and forever changing the way the American public viewed the safety of their private lives. The Black Dahlia, the murder that broke Hollywood. On the morning of January 15, 1947, a mother walking with her child in a vacant lot in Leimert Park, Los Angeles, spotted what she thought was a discarded store mannequin. As she got closer, she realized it was something far more horrific. It was the body of 22-year-old Elizabeth Short, an aspiring actress who would posthumously be known as the Black Dahlia. The crime was so brutal it seemed impossible for a human to commit. Her body had been severed completely in half at the waist, drained of all blood, and scrubbed clean. Most disturbingly, her face had been sliced from the corners of her mouth to her ears in a permanent, macabre grin known as a Glasgow smile. The precision of the bisection led investigators to believe the killer had surgical or medical training. The LAPD launched one of the largest investigations in history, questioning over 150 suspects, ranging from doctors and businessmen to Hollywood elites. The killer even taunted the police and the press, sending a packet containing Short's birth certificate and address book to the Los Angeles Examiner. Despite the thousands of leads and the sensationalized media coverage, the case went cold. Theories have circulated for decades. Some believe it was the work of a serial killer, others suspect a wealthy doctor named George Hodel whose own son later accused him of the crime. The Black Dahlia remains the ultimate symbol of the dark side of the Hollywood dream, a reminder that behind the glitz and glamour of the movie capital lies a history of violence and secrets that may never be fully unearthed. The 1963 Great Train Robbery, the heist of the century. While the robbery itself took place in the English countryside, the shockwaves and the subsequent manhunt became an international obsession that heavily involved American intelligence and law enforcement. On August 8, 1963, a 15-member gang intercepted a Royal Mail train heading from Glasgow to London. Using a sophisticated plan that involved tampering with track signals to stop the train in a remote area, the gang escaped with £2.6 million, the equivalent of about $60 million today. It was a heist of unprecedented scale and precision. However, the gang's downfall was a simple mistake. They hid out at a nearby farmhouse and played a game of Monopoly using real stolen cash, leaving their fingerprints all over the board. While most of the gang was eventually caught, the most famous member, Ronnie Biggs, escaped from prison and fled to South America, leading to a decades-long pursuit that became a staple of American tabloid news. The Great Train Robbery changed the way the world viewed organized crime, moving it away from the street thug image toward that of the professional outlaw. It forced a total overhaul of how high-value assets were transported globally and remains a textbook example of how even the most brilliant plan can be undone by a single moment of carelessness. The 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, the Day of Infamy. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the tropical paradise of Oahu, Hawaii, was shattered by a surprise military strike by the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. At 7:48 a.m., hundreds of Japanese fighter planes and bombers descended on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. The attack was devastatingly effective, for U.S. Navy battleships were sunk, including the USS Arizona, where over 1,100 sailors were trapped inside as the ship exploded and sank. In total, 2,403 Americans were killed and over 1,000 were wounded. For decades, conspiracy theories have swirled around whether President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew the attack was coming and allowed it to happen to force the United States into World War II. While historians have largely debunked this advanced knowledge theory, citing massive intelligence failures and bureaucratic chaos rather than a conspiracy, the event remains a permanent scar on the American psyche. It ended the era of American isolationism and turned the U.S. into a global military superpower. The memorial over the sunken hull of the Arizona still leaks oil today, black tears, for the men lost on that sunny Sunday morning, proving that some wounds in history never truly stop bleeding. The Challenger disaster, the day the sky broke. On the morning of January 28, 1986, millions of American schoolchildren were gathered around television sets in their classrooms, eyes glued to the screen in excitement. This was no ordinary NASA mission. It was the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger, and on board was Krista McAuliffe, a social studies teacher from New Hampshire who was set to become the first ordinary citizen in space. The mood was celebratory, a testament to the belief that space travel had become routine and safe. But at 73 seconds after liftoff, the unthinkable happened. A massive fireball erupted in the sky, and the shuttle disintegrated into a chaotic cloud of white smoke and debris. The 7 crew members were lost in an instant. The cause was a technical failure that became a landmark case in engineering ethics. A small rubber component called an O-ring had failed due to the unusually cold temperatures on the launch pad. Engineers at Morton Thiokol had warned NASA that the O-rings were not tested for such cold, but under political and public pressure to stay on schedule, the launch proceeded anyway. The disaster grounded the shuttle program for nearly 3 years and forced a total overhaul of NASA's safety culture. It was a brutal wake-up call for a nation that had grown overconfident in its technological prowess, proving that the vacuum of space remains a hostile and unforgiving frontier where even a tiny piece of rubber can change the course of history. The Toynbee tiles, the mystery etched in asphalt. Since the 1980s, pedestrians in dozens of major American cities, from Philadelphia and New York to Chicago and even as far as South America, have stumbled upon a bizarre and unsettling sight. Embedded directly into the asphalt of busy intersections are colorful, linoleum-like tiles, roughly the size of a license plate. They all carry a cryptic, apocalyptic message: Toynbee idea / in movie 2001 / resurrect dead / on planet Jupiter. For decades, the origin and meaning of these Toynbee tiles remained a total mystery. Were they a secret code for a cult? The work of a madman? Or a message from the future? The text appears to reference historian Arnold Toynbee and the Stanley Kubrick film 2001, A Space Odyssey. In the 2011 documentary Resurrect Dead, investigators traced the tiles back to a reclusive man in Philadelphia named Severino Randy Verna. He had allegedly created a method to place the tiles in the middle of busy streets by cutting out the asphalt, laying the tile, and letting the heat of passing car tires bake them into the road. Despite the identification of a likely creator, the tiles continue to appear, some appearing to be tributes by copycat artists. They remain one of the most intriguing examples of American urban folklore, a silent, cryptic scream for immortality etched into the very ground we walk on, reminding us that the city itself is a canvas for the strange and the obsessed. The 1993 Waco siege, the fire at Mount Carmel. In the spring of 1993, a remote compound outside Waco, Texas, became the stage for one of the most controversial and deadly standoffs in American law enforcement history. The Branch Davidians, a religious sect led by the charismatic and self-proclaimed Messiah David Koresh, were suspected of stockpiling illegal automatic weapons. What began as a botched raid by the ATF, resulting in a bloody shootout that killed 4 agents and 6 Davidians, turned into a 51-day siege by the FBI. The world watched as tanks and snipers surrounded the Mount Carmel Center, while the FBI used psychological warfare, playing the sounds of dying rabbits and Tibetan chants over loudspeakers to keep the inhabitants awake. On April 19, the FBI launched a final assault, pumping tear gas into the building. Suddenly, the compound erupted in flames. Within minutes, the wooden structure was a charred ruin. 76 people died in the fire, including 25 children and David Koresh himself. The government claimed the Davidians started the fire as a mass suicide pact, while survivors claimed the gas canisters ignited the blaze. The Waco siege became a massive rallying cry for anti-government groups and was the direct motivation for Timothy McVeigh's bombing of the Oklahoma City building exactly 2 years later. It remains a haunting example of how a breakdown in communication and the escalation of force can lead to a tragedy that scars the soul of a nation. The 1977 New York City blackout, the night the lights went out. On the sweltering night of July 13, 1977, New York City was a pressure cooker of economic decay, high crime, and the looming shadow of the Son of Sam serial killer. At 9:34 p.m., a series of lightning strikes hit key power substations in the Hudson Valley, triggering a catastrophic failure of the entire electrical grid. Unlike the peaceful blackout of 1965, the 1977 event descended into a 25-hour nightmare of anarchy and fire. As the city went dark, a wave of looting and arson swept through neighborhoods like Bushwick, East Harlem, and the South Bronx. Over 1,600 stores were ransacked, and more than 1,000 fires were set, turning the skyline into a glowing orange silhouette of chaos. The police, overwhelmed and unable to communicate effectively, made nearly 4,000 arrests, but the sheer scale of the unrest was uncontrollable. However, amidst the destruction, the blackout had an unexpected cultural impact. It is widely credited with the birth of hip-hop's mainstream rise. Thousands of expensive DJ turntables and mixers were looted from electronic stores, putting professional gear into the hands of young artists in the Bronx who previously couldn't afford it. By the time the power was restored, the city had suffered over $300 million in damages. The 1977 blackout remains a visceral symbol of the urban crisis era, a reminder that when the thin veneer of infrastructure fails, the underlying social tensions of a city can erupt with volcanic force. The mystery of the Sodder children, the Christmas Eve vanishing. In the small coal mining town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, on Christmas Eve of 1945, the Sodder family experienced a tragedy that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A fire broke out in their home at 1 a.m. George and Jenny Sodder escaped with 4 of their children, but 5 others, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were trapped upstairs. When George tried to rescue them, he found his ladder missing, his trucks wouldn't start, and the phone lines had been cut. The house burned to the ground in less than an hour. However, when the fire marshals sifted through the ashes, they found something impossible: no human remains. No bones, no teeth, and no scent of burning flesh. Despite the official ruling that the children died in the fire, the Sodders never believed it. They suspected the children had been kidnapped, possibly by the Sicilian mafia, due to George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini. Strange clues haunted the family for decades: a mysterious woman seen with the children at a hotel, a bizarre photograph mailed to them years later of a man resembling their son Louis, and a meat bomb found on their lawn. The Sodders spent the rest of their lives and their entire fortune on private investigators and a famous billboard on Route 16 featuring the children's faces. To this day, the case remains open, a chilling ghost story of the American heartland that suggests that even in the middle of a disaster, some people can simply evaporate into thin air. The 1910 Great Fire, the Big Burn. Long before the massive wildfires of the 21st century, the United States faced the Big Burn of 1910. A combination of extreme drought and hurricane-force winds turned hundreds of small spot fires in Idaho, Montana, and Washington into a single, massive inferno that consumed 3 million acres of forest in just 2 days. The fire was so intense it created its own weather systems, with fire tornadoes that ripped trees out of the ground by their roots. Towns like Wallace, Idaho, were almost entirely erased from the map. Buffalo soldiers and local volunteers fought the flames with little more than shovels and wet blankets. The most famous hero was Forest Ranger Ed Pulaski, who saved his crew of 45 men by forcing them into an abandoned mine shaft at gunpoint and hanging wet blankets over the entrance as the fire roared past. The Big Burn was the catalyst that led to the modern U.S. Forest Service's total suppression policy, a decision that would shape American environmental policy for a century. It remains the largest wildfire in American history, a terrifying testament to the raw, unbridled power of the natural world. The grand finale, the echoes of tomorrow, the final 7 minutes. We have reached the end of an epic journey through the shadows of the American timeline. For nearly 2 hours, we have peeled back the layers of a century defined by brilliance, madness, and the unexplained. We began in an era where parents could mail their children through the post office like packages, and we end in a world where artificial intelligence and digital surveillance define the very fabric of our reality. But through every part of the series, one truth remains: history is not a straight line, it is a mirror. We have looked into the depths of Area 51, where the line between national security and extraterrestrial folklore blurred into a permanent mystery. We saw the dark rooms of MKUltra, proving that the greatest threats to freedom can sometimes come from the very institution sworn to protect it. We stood in the blinding flash of the Manhattan Project, witnessing the moment humanity gained the power to script its own end. History is a circle. The masks of the 1918 Spanish flu returned as the masks of 2020. The bread lines of the Great Depression echoed in the financial collapses of the 21st century. We have seen that human nature, our greed, our curiosity, and our resilience, remains unchanged, even as our tools become more godlike. The Challenger disaster and the Hindenburg fire reminded us that even our greatest triumphs are fragile, held together by the thin thread of engineering and the unforgiving laws of physics. Yet, we also saw the light. We saw the courage of the sled dogs in the Great Serum Run, the defiant spirit of the Bonus Army, and the sheer audacity of the moon landing. These moments remind us that while the boring history books focus on dates, the real history is written in the heartbeat of the people who lived through the chaos. As the voice fades and the music takes over for the final hour of this experience, I want you to look around. The world we live in today, the smartphones in our pockets, the cities we walk through, the laws we obey, is built on the ruins and the victories of the stories we've just told. Today's headlines are tomorrow's mysteries. Today's viral moment is the strange anomaly that a historian will try to explain 100 years from now. We end this journey with a question: if history is a teacher, are we actually learning? Or are we simply waiting for our turn to become a chapter in someone else's documentary? The answers are hidden in the silence between the events, in the redacted lines of government files, and in the forgotten corners of the American heartland. The 20th century was the century of the machine. The 21st is the century of the mind. But the story of humanity is eternal. Thank you for walking through the dark with me. Stay curious. Stay skeptical. And above all, never stop looking behind the curtain. The 1982 Tylenol murders, the death of public trust. In the fall of 1982, the Chicago area was gripped by a random, invisible terror that would forever change how every consumer product in the world is packaged. It began on September 29, when 12-year-old Mary Kellerman took an extra-strength Tylenol for a cold and collapsed. She was dead before the ambulance arrived. By the end of the week, 7 people were dead, including 3 members of the same family who had all taken pills from the same bottle. Investigators quickly realized the capsules had been opened and filled with lethal doses of potassium cyanide. This was a nightmare scenario. A madman was poisoning random bottles on store shelves. The panic was national. Johnson & Johnson, in what is now considered the gold standard of crisis management, issued a massive recall of 31 million bottles, worth over $100 million. The killer was never caught, though several suspects, including a man who tried to extort the company for $1 million, were investigated. The legacy of the Tylenol murders is something we touch every day, the invention of triple seal, tamper-evident packaging. Before 1982, you could simply unscrew a cap and walk away. After 1982, the foil seal became the standard. It remains one of the most successful acts of domestic terrorism in terms of its lasting impact on society, a reminder that the most dangerous weapon isn't always a bomb, but a lack of security in the mundane. The Max Headroom incident, the hijacking of the airwaves. On the night of November 22, 1987, television viewers in Chicago were witness to the most sophisticated and bizarre broadcast signal intrusion in history. During the 9 p.m. news on WGN-TV, the screen suddenly went black, replaced by a man wearing a rubber Max Headroom mask, swaying erratically in front of a rotating corrugated metal background. The intrusion lasted only 30 seconds before engineers switched frequencies. However, 2 hours later, during a broadcast of Doctor Who on the PBS station WTTW, the intruder returned. This time, the audio was working. For 90 seconds, the masked figure uttered a string of bizarre, distorted non-sequiturs, hummed the theme to Clutch Cargo, and ended the segment by having a woman swat him with a fly swatter. To hijack a television signal in 1987 required massive microwave transmitters and precise timing. It wasn't something a casual hobbyist could do. The FCC and the FBI launched a massive investigation, but the Max Headroom hacker was never identified. It remains the ultimate digital ghost story of the analog era, a pre-internet meme that proved that even the most powerful media networks could be silenced and mocked by a single, motivated individual with a mask and a transmitter. The 1925 Serum Run, the reality of the Togo legend. While we previously touched on the heroism of the sled dogs in Nome, Alaska, the technical and logistical reality of the 1925 Great Race of Mercy is even more staggering when you look at the numbers. The temperature never rose above -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind chill plummeted to -85 degrees Fahrenheit. The 674-mile journey across the frozen Bering Sea and the jagged Topkoke Mountains was completed in just 127 hours. While Balto received the fame, it was the 12-year-old Siberian husky named Togo who led Leonard Sepala's team through a blinding whiteout over the unstable ice of Norton Sound. Sepala later remarked that he found it unbearable that the press gave the credit to the dog that ran the final, easiest 53 miles, while Togo had run 261 miles of the most treacherous terrain. This event wasn't just about a medicine delivery, it was the final stand of the working dog era before bush planes and snowmobiles made the sled dog obsolete. It remains a testament to the biological limits of endurance and the rugged, unforgiving nature of the American North. The grand finale, the echoes of tomorrow, the final 7 minutes. We have reached the end of an epic journey through the shadows of the American timeline. For nearly 2 hours, we have peeled back the layers of a century defined by brilliance, madness, and the unexplained. We began in an era where parents could mail their children through the post office like packages, and we end in a world where artificial intelligence and digital surveillance define the very fabric of our reality. But through every part of the series, one truth remains: history is not a straight line, it is a mirror. We have looked into the depths of Area 51, where the line between national security and extraterrestrial folklore blurred into a permanent mystery. We saw the dark rooms of MKUltra, proving that the greatest threats to freedom can sometimes come from the very institution sworn to protect it. We stood in the blinding flash of the Manhattan Project, witnessing the moment humanity gained the power to script its own end. History is a circle. The masks of the 1918 Spanish flu returned as the masks of 2020. The bread lines of the Great Depression echoed in the financial collapses of the 21st century. We have seen that human nature, our greed, our curiosity, and our resilience, remains unchanged, even as our tools become more godlike. The Challenger disaster and the Hindenburg fire reminded us that even our greatest triumphs are fragile, held together by the thin thread of engineering and the unforgiving laws of physics. Yet, we also saw the light. We saw the courage of the sled dogs in the Great Serum Run, the defiant spirit of the Bonus Army, and the sheer audacity of the moon landing. These moments remind us that while the boring history books focus on dates, the real history is written in the heartbeat of the people who lived through the chaos. As the voice fades and the music takes over for the final hour of this experience, I want you to look around. The world we live in today, the smartphones in our pockets, the cities we walk through, the laws we obey, is built on the ruins and the victories of the stories we've just told. Today's headlines are tomorrow's mysteries. Today's viral moment is the strange anomaly that a historian will try to explain 100 years from now. We end this journey with a question: if history is a teacher, are we actually learning? Or are we simply waiting for our turn to become a chapter in someone else's documentary? The answers are hidden in the silence between the events, in the redacted lines of government files, and in the forgotten corners of the American heartland. The 20th century was the century of the machine. The 21st is the century of the mind. But the story of humanity is eternal. Thank you for walking through the dark with me. Stay curious. Stay skeptical. And above all, never stop looking behind the curtain.